Good morning, folks. It's Camberley Bates from Evaluator Group, and welcome to the Container Native Cloud. I guess it is actually Cloud Data Management Days. So we have today a fabulous group of panelists talking about IT operations adapting to containers. And I'd like to introduce the crew. I'm the managing partner here at Evaluator Group, and if we can advance the next slide. I'd like to introduce the folks that are down below that you can see their faces. Krista Macomber, she's a senior analyst with our group, and she's going to be giving you doing a setup on some of the issues that we're facing with the IT operations and adapting to containers. Kris Cowles, who is the SVP of Information Technology at a company called Topcon. Really, really cool technology that they're doing. Audrey Reznik, she's a data scientist currently with Red Hat, but also is going to share some of experience doing data science work with folks like ExxonMobil and others. Gloria Xing, who comes from Germany. The rest of us are here in America, and she's in Germany. She's the engineering manager with SoundCloud. Has been working with containers. I think that's the only thing she knows, actually. Did anything else exist beforehand? And Xing Yang, she is the tech lead for data storage at VMware. She's also really kind of cool. She's co-chair with CNCF Storage SIG, has worked a whole lot on some of the technologies that they've been putting out there. So with that, what I'd like to do is kind of introduce a little bit about what we're talking today. The reason why we chose this topic is because of all the issues that we are hearing, Evaluator Group in particular, with our engagements with end users. We primarily work with the IT operations, and they're now starting to adopt the containers and bring that online into full production. And in doing so, like any other change of technology, they're finding that what DevOps says versus what IT Ops says, there's a little bit of changes in processes that need to go on. And this is a classic quote that we got from one of our clients when we were doing some interviews with them, is saying, okay, so how in the heck am I going to do this? And we are going to need a whole gamut from provisioning to monitoring to et cetera. And I think that just puts it in a nutshell. So with that, I want to just turn one slide over to Krista to talk a little bit about some of the issues that she's been researching on and been writing on as well. Go ahead, Krista.
Sure. Thanks so much, Camberley, and really excited to be here today. Appreciate everybody joining. So just the conversations, we have conversations on a very regular basis with customers, and there are definitely a few kind of common pain points that come up, especially as it kind of involves, kind of container environments and really just some of, like you were mentioning, Camberley, some of the new processes, right, that need to be adapted. The first one is sort of the lack of staff expertise. These are new architectures that are bringing about new requirements. And even if you think about the effort to sort of train IT on some of these new kind of technologies is incredibly difficult. The tools are very different from what IT is used to. And many of these tools require kind of a different knowledge base. For example, things like editing YAML files. Another pain point that we do commonly hear is that the developers are kind of driving this shift to containers, and they're creating these environments that are very difficult to manage from an IT operations standpoint. Developers are sort of, again, the ones that kind of moved to containers early, and then operations were left a little bit behind up front. And so now they're sort of having to catch up, and really that sequence that we tend to see in terms of the adoption being driven by the IT ops side is sort of a little bit out of order. Another challenge is that, this is a market that is still maturing when it comes to the tools for protecting data and for managing data. There's sort of that challenge. And then there's also the challenge that in many cases, IT is either not fully aware of the full set of tools that are out there, or they just haven't been able to sort of vet them yet. So we get a lot of questions about that. And then another challenge is sort of a lack of understanding of the performance and the security of containers. So there are sometimes questions in terms of, are containers really a fit for, running my business and for my most mission critical operations, and maybe a little bit of hesitation from that standpoint. The second to last bullet here, in my kind of research area, I personally hear a lot about this, and that's kind of the need for end-to-end visibility and sort of end-to-end control, not only across the sort of the container environment, but also when it comes to spanning the containerized and the non-containerized resources, because they do need to coexist, and we do need things like consistent data protection, kind of practices and outcomes, for example. And then the last point here, which I think really is going to be the crux of our conversation, is a lot of the collaboration, right, between development teams and IT operations teams. This really is a challenge. They tend to speak a little bit different languages, so they need some help kind of getting on the same page. And this is where sort of having a simplified environment, or maybe as kind of a simplified portal from an administration perspective, can come into play as well. And we see it really hasn't been delivered yet.
Thank you, Krista, very much. So I'm going to we're going to go ahead and go talk with the panel. From there, please submit some questions if you've got questions, and we'll lob those questions to the team. So with the first person, with those being talked about, Kris, would love you to start talking about as the practitioner of the group. Could you do a quick description of what you have experienced at Topcon and what's changed in your environment and how you've supported the engineering development?
Yeah, so we make hardware, software, services, and sort of solutions with the construction and agriculture markets, and our equipment specifically does things like 3D mobile mapping, laser surveying. We do machine control for large vehicles. So picture the concept of intelligent grading and paving, the ability to monitor how you're harvesting or how you're planting. So our equipment is fairly sophisticated, and over time we have not only offered software based on the device, but subscription services, data services, and because we know precisely what both the vehicle and the machine is doing, sometimes within centimeters, then the movement into IoT is an amazing opportunity for us. So what does that mean for my group in IT? We are one portion of the delivery mechanism to enable, we sell, activate, entitle, manage, renew software subscriptions and services. So our partnership with IT has had to change over the last 10 years. Everything from in the beginning where it was more they built and then handed over, and we sort of kind of tried to decompose what was happening, to more and more conversations about, what are the operational shared services or commoditized service that doesn't necessarily need to be in each individual piece of software that can be, co-developed, co-operated. And in order to effectively run these things, what do we need in terms of, diagnostics, triage, monitoring, and all the things that Krista mentioned in the beginning. So it's certainly been an evolution. I wouldn't say anybody, really has 100% of the secret sauce cracked. But now that we're on, second, third, fourth generations of some of these services, things that we had pursued conceptually at the beginning now are starting to be baked a little bit into the DNA of the organization.
Thank you, Kris. And we're still getting feedback from me. Okay, so I'm going to try to figure this one out. So Audrey, you implemented some really, really unique applications in your prior company. Maybe you can talk about some of the procedures, operational systems that had to change because of that, going from a world that was very monolithic to this very dynamic container application.
Right. So it was a big change. I mean, we weren't going to use the same old tools and practices to kind of deploy and manage our applications. You have to realize that we started basically within the group that I was within in upstream data science to trying to figure out how we could even deploy an application. Because most of the applications that were deployed basically to standalone computers. So you're jumping from standalone computers to, oh my gosh, the public cloud and a hybrid cloud scenario. So yeah, the biggest change was actually having to deal with some of these larger public cloud platforms, such as Azure, or on-prem collaboration platforms such as OpenShift. And I mean, that was a big jump right there, because it was not only the users that had to learn about things, but DevOps and data engineering, it was just a brand new field to them. So there were a lot of contractors that had to come on board from various outsourced resources to basically help everybody learn how to use this new environment. And I would say that in particular, the data science group, when we were looking at OpenShift, it was really something that encompassed not only DevOps and engineering, but security and controls, because it's one thing to have all of these new applications or new ways of doing things with containers, but then people started to really worry about, how do we keep our data secure? How do we keep our applications secure? And that really necessitated the need to bring security and controls kind of up to date into this new wide world of a containerization. I mean, it actually had to start with just, what is a container? How does a container work? And, it almost sounds humorous, but I mean, this jump just happened, 5 years ago. So the entire organization needs to basically shift, and that can be very scary. So when you're trying to get things deployed and you finally have IT and DevOps on board, you have to go through to security controls and say, okay, I'm going to walk you through some of these items. I'm going to show you an architecture that I've created that shows how we're going to deploy all of these apps within inside of containers, but I'm also going to show you how everything is secure within the environment that we had. So there are a lot of interesting changes that happened.
Yeah, and I know when Gloria, you and I talked, one of the things you talked about and also emailed me on was keeping the cluster healthy. That was one of the things that you guys were looking at. Is like, it's one thing to keep one little thing healthy, but it's when these things start scaling, all of a sudden it's a much bigger deal. You want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Audrey just mentioned it, right? No one knew in the beginning how to deal with containers at all, and definitely not with a deployment platform. And I mean, a few years ago, 5 years ago, I wasn't there at the time. My team, production engineering at SoundCloud, started to build up our own Kubernetes cluster. And back then it was still pretty difficult, right? Now you can start up your Kubernetes cluster with like 1-2 commands, or maybe a little bit more, but it's quite easy. However, like a lot more comes with that, right? It doesn't end with just setting up a deployment platform. There's a lot of like platform services that need to be integrated. And so in my team was more of an DevOps ops team in the start, and kind of went more into a platform team, and like the team that provides and maintains Kubernetes and also improves it, right? And builds services that interact with it, provides monitoring and so on.
Did they eventually separate out your DevOps and your operations team then? So you have separate groups now that you've grown bigger, or is it still integrated Dev and IT Ops?
It's more of a, like, from DevOps, it went more into like an SRE style team, right? Because what happened at SoundCloud is our developers always had a lot of autonomy, right? They wanted to build their applications and they would deploy their stuff on their servers and so on. And then suddenly a deployment platform is there, and it brings a lot of benefits, right? They can, deploy faster, roll out features quicker, and so on and so on. So what our team went into was more a team that like kind of provides consulting and guidance and trainings to developers. And like the operational load went more kind of like past us onto the developers.
Okay.
So we're like very mixed team.
Yeah, and I think when Chris and I chatted as well, I mean, from an IT operations, you guys hit issues about them not understanding performance and scale, for some of their applications, right?
Yeah. So, and I'll be generic here because this has happened in a number of companies. When you're shifting from device on-prem, let's call it permanent license-based software, to any type of, let's call it software over cloud and distributed systems, it's just a different mindset. I mean, people from an innovation standpoint tend to be focused on feature rich, right? And when you're operating, you tend to focus on what's the minimum viable set of boutique functions that you can deliver and monetize. And then everything else is about operating at the best possible profit, right? Which means minimizing support, minimizing costs in your infrastructure, and maximizing uptime, right? And that's where the partnership really can, not always does, but can hit a sweet spot, right? Because once something is engineered to operate over a distributed landscape, then everything is easier. If somebody's built a feature-rich application that suddenly they want to put on the internet and over cloud, and you've got latency issues, you've got session management issues, you might have security issues, then you're trying to refactor after the fact, and that is significantly harder. And customer experience has to be the religion for software over the cloud, because that is, what you're delivering is either a commodity that somebody could switch to something else, or it's, a critical function that's embedded in somebody's business, and therefore the tolerance for non-delivery is very, very low.
Yeah. So Xing, one of the things, I'm going to skip to another question here about end-to-end viewing and problem determination. Being able to view something that Krista mentioned was observability, which is a term that we just it's a hot term right now, right? So maybe you can talk about some of the things that you guys are doing, maybe at observability, either on the data management side or the other areas that the VMware is addressing or that you're addressing within the open source community.
Yeah, so we are trying to build observability into every level of the stack so that it will be easier for us to detect problems and find the root cause and be able to solve the problem quickly. Yeah, so that is something that we have been trying to do within VMware. And at the Kubernetes 6 storage level, we just added a new alpha feature called volume health monitoring. So in the past, without that, what happens is after the volume is provisioned and used by pod, Kubernetes doesn't really go and monitor the health. So the volume could be deleted outside of Kubernetes knowledge, or it could be go out of capacity, and we won't find out until applications start to use that volume. So with this feature, Kubernetes can actually communicate with the storage system and detect the abnormal condition of volume early so that it can report events on PVCs or pods ahead of time. This way user can react and get the problem resolved early. Yeah, so I think this is something that we are doing both in Kubernetes upstream community and also within my own team inside VMware. We are trying to add metrics so that we could set alerts when something happens so that we can react properly. So the goal is to make it easier for the operator to detect the problems early and find the problem early. So we can actually have some kind of, ultimately we want to have a self-healing system. So customers don't have to go call customer support, just can click a button and get the problem resolved automatically. That's the end goal.
Well, that's a ways away. So maybe you guys can comment on that, about what you guys are needing, what you're experiencing now, and what you're really wanting from the folks out there, both the vendors and the users. Anybody? Kris, Gloria?
I mean, from my standpoint, we're running. There's two dimensions. I'm running multi-cloud architectures as an actual IT corporate function. So as a consumer of cloud services, there's one aspect of it. And then now I'm also the provider of cloud services for my engineering organization and delivery. So there's, in both cases, what you're looking for is visibility. I mean, if you're in a classic IT executive role, you're what I call Maslow's hierarchy of firing, right? I mentioned this with you before, right? It's the systems have to be up, they have to be fast, they have to be compliant, and the new, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years is they have to be secure, right? And they've always had to be secure, but it's a completely different paradigm right now. So that's what you live and breathe, right? And when you start getting into these distributed architectures, the number of actors involved in any one delivery of a service, you may have multiple engineering teams doing pieces of the actual service itself. You have the platform that you're using, whether it's Azure or AWS or GCP, you have, a security provider, a firewall person in there, you may have an identity and access management, and then you have the actual sort of back-end services. And sometimes you might have a, third-party API, mashing in some data in there and everything else, right? And the customer's gonna know that something's wrong almost, some measure of time significantly before you do, because they're banging on it, right? Mm-hmm. And so the goal is to minimize the gap between when they sense that there's a problem and when you know that there's a problem. And then the second piece of that is, okay, well, then how many of those parties involved in the chain do you need to get on the phone to see what's going on? How quickly can you isolate where the issue is, and then subsequently figure out what to do about it? Because the more people you have on that call, the higher your support costs go, and the longer it's going to take to figure out how to resolve the situation for the customer, right?
So it's how fast can I get to the point that I'm delivering the service again, and what's that visibility like? Audrey?
I'd like to chime in.
Please.
Cool. So we at SoundCloud are mostly using or running microservices at the moment, right? And what really helps us to find issues and where the issues are is that we're all using the same monitoring system, Prometheus, and Grafana as a dashboard solution. So it's not ideal and amazing monitoring everywhere. Metrics from everywhere would be great, but what helps is that we have pretty good incoming, outgoing request metrics from services. So what we usually do is we see yes, the user notices there's errors, we see error spikes, we see raising 500s, and we kind of track down from one graph to the next which microservice actually causes these errors. And that works relatively well for us. And that way we can direct to the teams, to the developers themselves, to actually try to solve the issue as quick as possible.
Yeah, I think the landscape is changing significantly, and there's no perfect tool, but there's a number of companies that are now offering platforms, diagnostics, next generation monitoring. I think the tricky part is also ultimately, particularly if you are delivering to devices in locations around the world, that there's endpoint monitoring issues that we haven't quite gotten 100% around, particularly when you get into data privacy and some limitations. But I think there's a whole generation of tools coming out to the market and things that can significantly change the conversation of, how quickly we are able to respond as an organization.
Audrey, were you about to pop in for a second there?
Yeah, I was just going to pop in and say, and I'll take it from kind of the science view and kind of go into DevOps. Being lucky enough to work with the OpenShift platform, which kind of uses the Kubernetes background, both in the large energy company that I worked for and here within Red Hat. We do have a concept of kind of managed services that we can use now. And I think those are becoming more prevalent, where, as someone mentioned, you can use Prometheus, you can use Grafana to go ahead and kind of monitor, the health of your application or the health of your container or pod. We're going to see so much more of that. I mean, again, that's just something that's coming new to the forefront that the ladies have talked about, but it's still in its infant stages as far as I'm concerned. We're going to see a lot more. So for those who are despairing, help us find a way.
Despair. So Xing, you're trying to solve some of those despairing things, right?
Well, so I think from the Kubernetes, the development side, I just want to mention that we actually introduced something called a production readiness review recently. So this is basically just going back to the point that Kris made early on. Operators want to have minimum viable features that is usable, but maybe developers want something that is feature rich, right? So there is a gap there. So what we are trying to do is how to bridge this gap. So for every feature that is developed in Kubernetes, we have to go through this production readiness review to make sure that features developed in Kubernetes are observable, scalable, supportable, and can be safely operated in production, and can be disabled and rolled back if they cause problems. Yeah, so there is this big question there that everyone has to figure out when he or she introduces a new feature. Basically, they ask you questions like, so there is always a feature gate when you introduce a new feature in Kubernetes, right? So if you disable this feature gate after the feature is already rolled out, is there a way to disable it and roll it back? What's the impact on the existing workloads? And also, what metrics are you going to add along with this feature? Can an operator just look at the metrics and detect problems easily? And look at the impact on the scalability. Does this feature increase the load to the Kubernetes API server? Does it take longer now for operation to finish? Does it use more resources? And how to troubleshoot problem? Are the metrics good enough for operators to look at and detect problems? Or do we have log messages that are useful? So now when we develop a feature, we have to look at all of those before the design can be approved. So this was not there before.
So in clarity, operational readiness review, and I'm getting feedback again on me, so I'll do this real quick, is a construct that the CNCF has established before they bring anything into introducing it to Kubernetes, correct?
Yeah, this is more from the Kubernetes side.
Right,
yeah.
It's on the Kubernetes piece.
Kubernetes community, yeah.
Right. But
so
that's
sure that the developers can look at a feature from an operator's point of view, because this was missing in the past.
Okay, which is a huge step forward for us, making sure that we can trust the open source code that's coming out, with Kubernetes, et cetera. Okay. To that end, we have IT ops mindset has had to change. There's also new skills that have been needed. Maybe if somebody wants to grab that one, what new skills have been needed that in going into a container operational market space in IT? Gloria or Kris?
Sure.
Anybody?
I mean, but for us, we really saw like that we need people with like a solid software engineering skills and system and operational understanding, right? So like people who are kind of like hybrid. That's not easy to find. That's for sure. So what we do is we take people who are either good software developers or a good, strong operations people, and we train them. So we really like put a lot of work into developing these skills. And so we are looking for people, like we need people who are really motivated, who want to learn, who are excited to, run applications end to end, not just write code, but also like make sure these applications run in production, they're scalable, they're monitored, and really like understand the operations part as well.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I think for us, when we started 5 years ago, everybody come to Jesus moment. It's like, we're going to need to understand all of this. It's just no longer the part where you take one thing and you hand it off to somebody else and you forget about it. That no longer exists. And people who are comfortable in that sort of mindset, you had to really encourage them to reach out and to learn some of the new methodologies, learn some of the new terminology, learn how the new workflow was going, because they're going to have a part in it now. If they want to stay in that job, they have to have a part in it. And this is something else that I'll bring to the forefront as we're bringing, as people are learning more, our users are learning more too. And those guys can get very devious, especially when we give them more tools. So in my side, it was like, yeah, we have this great platform. We can go ahead and we can help you deliver applications. And they're like, oh, well, what if I just like reset this pod on my own? Hello, it's like when your application's not working. So the education and flow of everything that's happening in our new reality is just not with, IT operations and DevOps, with the users too, because they're getting a lot more power, and you have to get everybody to work together. So on that note, I would say it's like, if you do have opportunities where you're working with a larger group of people, or lunch and learn or something, bring everybody together. Let them learn the mistakes that somebody else has made, because I can guarantee you they'll find that same situation in the future. So trying to some sort of grassroots organization where you have DevOps and IT and data scientists and everybody together is vitally important, I think, right now to succeed to succeed in this new world that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would add to that, or even just elaborate, it's a different sense of collaboration. I mean, I think if you think about the original sort of IT programmer, it was a very siloed vertical stack type of approach. And the need to collaborate. And I also think that there used to be this like 6 degrees of separation between the user and the original engineer who built something, right? It was, you built it and it went someplace, and then a customer was doing something with it. And there was a pretty significant lag / disconnect. And now, in order to be effective in what we're doing, you really have to understand not just that they're going to use what they're using it for, but that they're not going to use it for what you thought they were going to use it for. And you have to take a certain level of accountability for the fact that this is now a distributed system where people are going to act on it in ways that you maybe didn't anticipate. And instead of being afraid of that, you have to believe that that's the purpose of it. That is the purpose of enabling innovation, which is a real mindset change. And we're still going to need expertise in the vertical stack, but we're also going to need people who understand that the goal is to accelerate change in a stable and secure way. And that isn't necessarily something that you find in the traditional sort of IT mentality. It tends to be more on the engineering side. So then how do we invite the culture that is the best of both worlds?
Yeah, it's, I've seen multiple people that are, that are product what I would call product people, but product people, a product that's being brought, that's a application, web application. And listening to some of their stories of going live and rollback, going live, rolling back, going live and rolling back. And while it's great that you can roll back, it's still disruptive. And it does show, there's an element of saying, okay, so your confidence level of the user in those environments lessens in there. So that need to making sure that what you were talking about in a different level of the making sure something is production ready becomes, as we go forward, and depending upon what you're pushing out the door, making sure that it is not disruptive to the business. Even though you can roll back and regroup and that kind of thing, it becomes much more important. So to that end, how do you make sure things are ready to go to production? Do we, the old monolithic stuff, you had all the testing and you tested from one end to the other end, and you spent all this time doing that before you rolled, and even then sometimes it didn't go successfully. How do we make sure that these things are really ready to go to production without being disruptive?
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit again. Sorry if I'm monopolizing all the time.
No, you're good.
With the new company that I'm with here with Red Hat right now, we just had such a thing with our Red Hat OpenShift Data Science platform that we released. But it was really interesting now to be on the back end, not from another company where we're consuming the services, but where we're building the services. And what really impressed me was the ability for everybody to not only attend some of the Scrum sessions together. We're talking about QA, some of the pilot testers, DevOps and IT, but also having those Slack or Google Chat sessions available so that as weeks or days progressed, everybody was talking about what was going on. And because everybody was within that one channel, they could say, oh yeah, that's DevOps, we'll take care of that. And someone else said, oh yeah, God, this is IT Ops, we'll take care of that. Pilot testing, which is something that I ran, I was like, okay, I'm going to set the pilot testers on this so that when we actually do come out with that end product, everybody touched it, right? We've touched it together. It hasn't been separate little chunks. And then together we've been able to kind of successfully deploy, our application.
Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, maybe for us, it works a little bit differently with all of the microservices. We still have like underlying infrastructure kind of like separated concerns for different teams, right? So how we can make sure that things don't cause too many interruptions, or we as a E team, as a site reliability team, we help engineers to do these like production readiness reviews, kind of like Xing mentioned them, but they're voluntarily. So people have the autonomy to just do it, and if something breaks, they're accountable for it. But at least they only break their small feature, right? And of course, there's ways to roll it back and so on. But this is like one of the things that's really great because in the end, if people do break things, right? We all come together in postmortems, and we, as a engineering organization, look at it together and try to learn out of what went wrong. And ideally, this doesn't happen again. So it's kind of like we're trying to like minimize the problems that come up by separating concerns, but then like all come together and like talk about it without blame, but just like with the intent to learn and to prevent the next time.
So we've got like 1 minute left, and I have one question that came in that says, from a deployed microservice-based SaaS offering, who do you envision is responsible for data restoration given the shift in complexity?
It's a complex question because it really sort of depends on what the upfront agreement on that service is and what exactly it does. But I would say more of the burden is on the SaaS provider than on the end user, right? A lot of the data isn't even stored locally to some degree. There may only be small pieces of data that are stored locally. So my bias would be towards the SaaS provider.
Okay, great. Thank you. So any other final comments from anybody? Because we are now at the top of the hour. Hey, guys, thank you very much. Guys is a California term, general term for people. Anyways,
yes, for people.
For people, given that I was in California in my teenage years. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate all your time that you spent with me and with the crew. Have a fabulous, great day, guys.
And girls.
Bye.
Bye.